This show is brought to you by Safety FM.
Welcome to episode 24 of the Practice of Learning Teams. Today's podcast is part one of a two-part discussion with Gary Wong. Gary Wong is a complexity facilitator, or as I reference in this episode, more of a sense maker. Gary is based in Vancouver, British Columbia. Gary runs his own consulting practice focusing on complexity thinking and safety. This was one of those podcasts where the conversation was so deep and meaningful that the time just disappeared. The content was so good I couldn't reduce it to our normal 30-minute format. Next episode, we'll continue the journey with Gary, and then I'll be joined by my fellow colleagues Glynis, McCarthy and Brent Robinson. We'll then conduct a mini-learning team of the key threads and themes from those conversations with Gary. Please, join us now as we hear from Gary in his world of storytelling and making sense of complexity and safety. Welcome, Gary, to the podcast, The Practice of Learning Teams. Thank you for joining us from British Columbia.
Thank you, Brent. I'm very happy to be with you today.
And look, it's been a long time coming, and I've been observing your development over time and enjoying your podcast with Todd and with others. And of course, I understand that you have a great appreciation of both New Zealand and Australia.
Oh, yeah. Last November, and let me check the year, 2019, I had the opportunity of coming down, staying at Sydney, doing a workshop, what I call adaptive safety, with the safety professionals in Brisbane. Then hopped across the water and did something similar with that in Auckland as well.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. And look, I am hopeful, and I keep saying this, I'm hopeful that in 2022 we can organise some form of road show, and we can bring down people like yourself, Todd, Jay Allen, Jeff Lyth, a whole bunch of people, and we'll do a great road show around New Zealand and Australia. And hopefully,
by all means, waiting for the invitation.
I'm all vaccinated by then.
I think it'd be just as much fun being on stage and off stage.
Okay, you betcha. I mean, sadly, I've spent too many an evening with Todd in the US, so absolutely. But what happens on tour stays on tour, as they say. So
Yes, right.
So Gary, like everything else, I thought it was really useful for you to sort of help to share a little bit about your own journey. And where you think the opportunity for learning comes from, because our listeners really appreciate sort of getting those different perspectives and those different views from different people, because it's supposed to be called safety differently for a reason. So
yeah, learning is interesting. I mean, when you just look at the word itself, what is it? You're learning something new, whether it's a skill or some knowledge. Then you got to apply it. So I'm an engineer, Brent, so I kind of follow theory, application, and practice. So I first of all learn it as some sort of a theory. Then I go like, well, that's cool, but where can I use it? Where can I apply it? Which is cool. And then once you go like, oh, I can apply it in safety or in operations, then it's kind of like, I need to roll up my sleeves and get some practice. Or as we say, practice makes perfect. So that's kind of learning for me. Then along my journey here, of course, you come across things like Peter Senge did with the learning organization, the fifth discipline. Oh, what does this kind of mean here? Then we start to really recognize that it's just not all about the technology. It's about the human aspects as well. Where maybe back in the early 20s, when we took people, we treated them as cogs of a machine because it was all about production, using the technology and making sure that those humans don't screw up the process. And if they do, throw them out and bring someone else in here. Well, that lasted for a while there. And of course, we moved into the human factors because we can't keep on going that way. And in some respects, This is where the unions, for them, they came on and became a voice for the workers saying, we've got to stop doing this here. And that kind of like opened up eyes. We kind of got into that learning organization, business process reengineering era of the 80s and the 90s here. So humans were no longer cogs in the machine, but now they were just a part. They were just a part, of a system, the other parts being technology and process. And I kind of got involved in that. I drank the Kool-Aid in that, really got into it. Being an engineer, why not? I really liked the idea. I got involved in organizing the different teams that would be, there's an IT team for the technology, and there's a business analyst process team, and then we'd have all the HR folks forming the people team. And I'm always interested to see how we would do that reductionist thing, break up the teams, let them work independently. Every week we would kind of bring them together just to make sure that they're kind of talking to each other here. And at the end of the project here, hopefully everything would kind of work together. But it always didn't kind of work together here. And in hindsight, the learning for me, if you like, is that we didn't really understand the importance of relationships and interactions.
Right.
And this is it. So in the what we call the order system, where you can break things down and put them back together, just like repairing an engine in a car, it works just fine. But over in the complex system, we're dealing with mayonnaise. How do you break down mayonnaise into its ingredients? And the answer is you really can't. But we try to anyways, and it doesn't, and sometimes it fails. And then we scratch our heads. Well, what are we learning from this? The key learning that we're discovering now is that you've got to understand, are you in the ordered system where things can be broken down? Or no, you have to work holistically in the complex system here. And we're also saying too, another learning is, this is not an either or, Brent. This is a both and.
Yeah.
And you just got to understand as a learning team, what are you dealing with? Because as a learning team, we can get really good and train the team members to be good at using a hammer. But what we also have to do is get to understand you can't, because if you get really good at using a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? Even if it's a screw. But you don't know any better, you're going to pull it out of your toolkit and start bashing away at a screw, wondering what's wrong with this darn screw here. Maybe do more damage in the organization?
Oh, absolutely. And look, and we sort of coined that phrase, weaponization.
Okay.
We're really good at taking systems. We're really good at taking those systems and breaking them into linear processes. And then train people and then wonder why they become weaponized. I was recently doing a review. When we wrote the book of the Practice of Learning Teams, we did something quite controversial. We talked about the value that root cause could be with a learning team. Now, a whole lot of people were out with pitchforks and burning stakes, saying that, you can't do that. But what we did was we actually went back and we looked at what was the purpose of root cause. And its purpose and how it's been applied has been weaponized. And what we identified was that root cause is supposed to be used to learn about the future from focus events that may not have occurred yet. So it can be used to understand about things that have happened, but it can also be used to understand about things that haven't happened yet. And what we talked about when we looked at learning teams, what we found was that storytelling was extremely powerful, absolutely amazingly powerful. But what we found was that there was this thing called latent knowledge that existed in work teams. And latent knowledge was this knowledge that a person couldn't bring out in that storytelling process unless they aligned it with something. And what we found was that we converted a root cause into a critical reflection component, so that once the storytelling was finished and people were really on board and they enjoyed it and they valued, the facilitator was able to, from an assurance point of view, just get a little bit more out of them. So say, for instance, if during the learning team there hadn't been any conversation about the need for supervision, or what supervision looked like, or what was good supervision in the work that you do, then the facilitator was able to then ask that curious question of that group. Because through the storytelling, they didn't think about, how does supervision support successful work, if that makes sense. Whereas in root cause, we've used it to find failure, which was the person wasn't supervised, supervisor wasn't present, all the usual, what we call the dark end of safety.
I think one of the other key learnings is understanding that, okay, I have an engineering background, so I have a body of knowledge that I've learned from education and practice, whatever. You've been in the business IT world, done the same sort of stuff here. And for me, starting back about 10 years ago, I got introduced to the world of anthropology and ethnography, basically storytelling here. And I'm going like, what the heck is this all about here?
Yeah.
Kind of got myself immersed in that and going like, oh my God, what ethnographers can kind of do is answer the why question. Because as you know, when we do IT stuff, data analytics, we get a lot of big data, which is the what, the where, the who.
Yeah.
But we don't get the why. So why did the person behave this way here? And that's where the anthropology, the ethnography, it comes out because it has the context.
Yeah.
And context, as I think we all saying, is so important that you got it. And that's why you can help understand why people behave this way.
Absolutely. Look, similar. I was about 7 years ago. I did a piece of work with organisation around adult education, and once again, adult ed is built on those great principles that you're talking about. And it was the same thing. It was basically it was a focus around issues around literacy, numeracy, and the effect on the workplace. Mm-hmm. We actually did a lot of work around this thing called safety literacy, which is that people that have issues, particularly say people where English is a second language, that basically we've got to stop dumbing down systems. That's our approach at the moment. If someone doesn't understand, let's simplify it, let's dumb it down. Okay. Well, a person with a learning difficulty is highly intelligent. The problem is that if we don't talk about stuff in a way that relates to them, how can they form that mental model or that mental mode? Because that's what matters to them at the end of the day. And the classic one is in safety. The really good one in safety is that we constantly talk about risk management and hazards. And we constantly talk about risk management is that you've got to understand things like likelihood, probability, severity, consequence. I got to tell you that language is not in the average workbook for people.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay.
Right.
So what we talked about things like charts and impact.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things that we're discovering is that it's all about meaning making.
Yeah.
And even using the word story, we have to be careful with that. Good example is that even down in Australia, and these are my colleagues down in Australia, and they're saying, we may not be able to use the word story at all here. So we have to find a word like observation or experience as opposed to stories. I know that I had that experience when I was over in LA, and I was doing about story collecting, which we do, to the HR manager. And she said oh, you mean those Hollywood type stories of fiction? And I go like, not really. But that's what she was born and raised on, Hollywood stuff.
Yeah.
LA. I'm going, no, we're really talking about real life experiences that people had that they can share with us as stories. So I was very careful, and maybe we used the word narratives instead. We don't use that. Just to kind of tweak the language here, because I was also dealing with a fair number of people that did not speak English was their second language, let's say here. So I had to find a language that kind of like worked with them. So there's this whole other area where we're trying to explore now with semiotics, looking at words, looking at symbols. I mean, you look at the world of safety, and boy, we have a lot of symbols. What do they kind of mean?
We love a good sign.
Yeah, but the sign, it could be round, it could be hexagonal, it could be rectangular. They all have a bit of meaning, and the colors have something else.
It can be, we have yellow, we can have a bit of black, we can have blue, because it all has meaning.
Yeah, and in a webinar I was just on, I was just kind of saying this and figured, what we don't have is kind of like a symbol for the washroom yet. And then I kind of showed pictures of, here's the different symbols representing male, female, transgender. We've got all these different things here. And somebody kind of said to her, yeah, there's a standard and they're trying to work on a universal standard for washrooms. Wow. I mean, like, it's kind of like, it took me to a whole other level going like, signs are so powerful, right? Really, really powerful. But that's all about meaning making. Yes. And that's all about stories. And this is how we actually learn as well.
Yes. But the problem is signs don't give meaning. Signs are the what. Maybe a touch of the how, but never the why.
Yeah. So this is why it comes back down to interpretation. And the way that we collect stories, Brent, is we actually will gather stories, and everybody can gather stories. I mean, it's natural. We're natural storytellers, so there's a lot of power there. We collect them. But once you gather them, the question is, what do you do with them? Yep. And a lot of cases, if you're a consultant and you collect 40 stories, your interviews, whatever here, you can see what's going on in your mind and you're figuring out here, okay, I see some themes popping up or there's some patterns here. Mm-hmm. But we also know too, and we can't help it, we all have our cognitive biases.
Of course.
And before you know it, we start saying here, oh, I've seen that before.
Yeah.
And how, maybe you haven't, whatever, but that's what comes out here. So we had to try to find a method. And when I say we, I'm referring to Dave Snowden and Cognitive Edge. Right. Dave's been doing this for the past 20 years. So I've been one of the colleagues that have been moving the practice along. And he was just kind of saying, yeah, we really, the best thing we can do is get the authentic voice. What do you mean by that? That's the storyteller. We have to get the storyteller to interpret it. So if I were to give you a story here and you kind of say, well, that's really negative as a consultant, the story is there. Oh, no, I meant that to be positive. Mm-hmm. So we have to capture that. So we actually have SenseMaker software that captures the interpretation from the storyteller. So from those interpretations, we can now produce these maps, these what we call narrative landscapes. And now, we've had so many advances in data visualization tools and data analytic tools here. We can actually create a 2D contour map, show that to a decision makers and go like, this is what's happening today. You can see the contour maps. You can see where people are clustered. That's what we call attractors. Yep. So really the question is, why do you think they're kind of behaving this way here? We can ask a whole different set of really interesting questions that we couldn't do before. And the big intervention question is, would you like more stories like these, fewer stories like that?
Okay, absolutely. And we talk about the fact is that, when events happen, we see that obvious divide between work as imagined and work as done.
Yeah.
Okay. And I'm yet to see an event where there wasn't a divide. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. People don't really answer that, but there's always going to be a divide because that divide is normal.
Yeah, normal variability.
Normal variability.
Yep.
And I sometimes ask myself, a lot of cases, that this divide or this gap, as we call it, or chasm, if it's a big one, is simply an accumulation of all those micro changes or those micro learnings that have happened.
Yeah.
But those micro learnings aren't intentional learning. They're what we call incidental learning that the workers had in that whole sort of complex world they're having to work in. And we sort of said that, wouldn't it be great to be able to gather intelligence at the micro learning end?
Mhm.
And how can we turn that learning from being incidental learning to being deliberate learning?
Yeah, right, right.
And it's the same thing that you're talking about, because what we said was that if the organization can start to see these patterns,
Mhm.
then what it can do is that the organization can then be curious to find out more.
Yeah, right.
Whereas a
So
lot
we're
of the time we're using it as an intervention tool. We're
yeah,
basically saying, you know,
right.
we want to
Yeah,
stop that from happening rather than actually understanding why it's happening, which is that deeper context, if that makes sense. Sort of.
yeah, right. So when I'm in front of decision makers or so, I'm kind of say it really boils down to this here. We want to capture those narratives, experience, where people will say, good old Star Wars, I've got a bad feeling about this.
Mhm.
I want to capture those early so you can do something about them before they turn into stories like, I knew that was going to happen.
Yeah.
Right? So how do we do that here? Is there a way that you can capture those things here? So I kind of bring in that blue line and black line idea as well, because I kind of say that's where the learning is taking place.
Hmm.
Not at the end, when the incident occurs, a little late. You want to capture all those things here, and then you can pull in all the stuff about we should be collecting stories where things go right. Safety too, if you like.
Well,
What was the change in the conditions that the frontline worker had to do to adjust to these unforeseen sort of forces that came out, whether it was wind, rain, or whatever? What did they do? And I come from the premise of safety is an emergent property of a complex adaptive system.
Mhm.
So it's not created, whatever, it emerges here. So I kind of suggest, well, if you see this and it's starting to rain, you go and you put your rain gear on. You're actually creating a condition which you have control of putting on your stuff that enables safety to emerge. But you also have to be careful because you put now some heavy stuff, and your flexibility is maybe you've enabled danger to emerge as well. We don't know. Why? Because we've got these things called tipping points,
Mhm.
and they're typically hidden. With machines, they're probably more explicit because we have gauges. Oh, you're going to overload, whatever here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And yeah, with humans,
Yeah, absolutely.
tipping points are so hidden, right? Every day a person comes to work, you don't know if the state of mind the person's in, whether they're tired, had an argument, or really, really happy because their cricket team won, or whatever, right?
Of course.
But right, so all these things are there, which may enable danger, not safety to emerge here. So we work off that premise here. But the other thing that we want to do too is find out from those workers, so what did you do in order to enable safety to emerge here?
Right.
And quite often they'll go like, well, we did have to bend the rule, whatever here.
Mhm.
Okay, understand that, normal variability. What did you do? So they kind of going, well, we did this, we did it. Oh, these are these heuristics that these people kind of know. So one of the key things that we're beginning to capture now is all this tacit knowledge that's
Yes.
in the mind of the person.
Yeah.
We're beginning to kind of like, we can take that tacit knowledge, at least document it as a narrative, as a story. Then go around and kind of saying, well, this is what Joe does. What do you do, Pete? What do you do, Anna? Then you realize, hey, there is a pattern here. This is a good heuristic here.
Mhm.
Maybe we should allow everybody else to kind of going, if you have this situation, let's use these heuristics here.
Yeah.
But let's also be mindful that for this situation, it may not work. We don't know. At least it will increase the chances or probability that success will emerge.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, we talk about this thing about that workers have been losing a skill around critical thinking and critical reflective skill.
Mm-hmm.
And that type of skill is really essential when you're dealing with dynamic risk.
Yeah, yeah.
And a lot of our rules framework that we've been applying sort of has been removing that element of that critical thinking. And when we talk about that, what we're not saying that the person's a rocket scientist. What we're saying is that that person is able to reflect, and we talk about this concept of learn, do, and challenge.
Mm-hmm.
So rather than learning something, then applying it, okay, we're actually saying you need to challenge yourself and ask yourself why.
Mm-hmm.
So you know, what's that component what's that bit that's meaningful to you? Because it's that reflective component, that challenging component that helps build that skill for us as humans.
Yeah.
Because everything else we're doing has been so systemized to hell,
Mm-hmm.
we don't have to
Yeah.
worry about it anymore.
Yeah, that's to me, that's the downside of best practices.
Yeah.
Best practices are great because they have worked in the past, and hopefully they'll continue to work here. It's easy because there's no thinking. This is the practices, and this is what you do here. What we're trying to do now is say, I like to give more credit to workers who can think. We're not ants or birds or termites. We actually can think as humans here. And because of that, we can make choices here. We're saying here, we're not going to give you a book of recipes because you are not recipe followers. We want you to be chefs. We want you to be cooks. So by being a chef, what does that mean? That means that you're going along, you're creating your cake, then you look in the fridge, you go like, oh, look at that. We ran out of milk, we ran out of eggs, whatever here. As a recipe follower, you're kind of like snookered. What do I do now, right? And scramble. As a chef, you're kind of going, I understand the principles behind cooking.
Okay. Yeah.
Therefore, I know what to substitute to kind of give that right taste, texture, flavor that's required.
Absolutely.
That's what we're trying to develop.
Yeah, no, look, I'm with you because we know in cooking, and I trained a little bit as a chef, that you basically have to have, salt, sugar, and fat are the three components.
Yeah.
Okay.
And heat. I read the book.
Yeah, absolutely. At the end of the day, you can have something that's low in fat, but it's had to be substituted with something high in sodium or sugar.
Yeah.
Makes sense?
Yeah,
Exactly.
exactly.
Sugar, and it's going to be substituted with something high in fat or salt. That's because those are the three things that people like. They're the three core elements. So absolutely, a good chef is always someone who can substitute, because it's about creating that thing in the brain. Because food for us is actually, it's about enjoyment.
Now what we want to do is be able to develop the habit where workers like to share their cooking experience on the job. As a chef, I substituted this in here, and we successfully finished the job. Those are the good stories. We want to share those things and capture those things as wow, right? So we try to make it easy for them, Brent. When we say capture here, we know that we can, and everything we try to do is online because we have the tools here.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, if you're in an office here, desktop worker, you can go to the desktop, you can fill it in, you can quickly do your story, you can what we call interpret it or signify it. Then there it is. For the field, worker in the field, you can actually have an app on your iPhone or your Android phone. And we have extra powers there because you don't have to actually type in a story because that's tough. You can actually do a voice recording.
Mm-hmm.
You can actually take a picture of the situation as well. And what's that telling us is that the story itself is useful, but from a point of granularity, it's down here.
Yeah.
What we're really trying to get to is the next level up, which is the patterns, which you've already talked about here.
Yeah, that's right. It's that context.
We want to capture the patterns, right?
Yeah.
So we can actually come, and one of an area that we're really becoming aware of now with COVID-19 and the next normal is the concerns about well-being. We're noticing that, my God, there's a fair number of youth suicides that are happening here. I think that's something we're going to have to somehow adjust and make some changes on here. Well, what we're trying to do is capture those sort of stories, and again, prevent them before some failure takes place, some tragedy takes place there.
Yeah, I mean, rather than sadly, rather than learning from misery, because that's a lot of what happens at the moment. We're sort of learning after the fact because it's hard. And look, I absolutely understand where you're coming from, because it's challenging, because it doesn't matter what anyone how they say it, but everyone is affected where you are placed in a situation for a period of time where there is uncertainty, where's that loss of control. So, and you've seen it exhibited. We had an example where basically there was a run on toilet paper is a good example. we were moving into level 4, and there was a huge run on toilet paper. Now, we don't import toilet paper, we make it. Okay. But what I didn't understand was that I can see this behaviour going on, the herd mentality kicking in.
Yeah.
I'm saying to myself, I didn't know that you died from diarrhea with COVID-19. I didn't know that it was that type of disease, because I'm trying to understand what's this pattern of behaviour about. Mm-hmm. It's just that whole thing about uncertainty and the human ability to want to have some form of control, and that was the early stages. And it hasn't changed. It's just we've evolved.
Yeah.
We've evolved.
So when I do my adaptive safety, I try to distinguish between the order system and the complex system. Because in the order system here, and again, it's a both and, in the order system, root cause analysis, all those things work well. Why? Because it's what we call a causal system. Causal means if-then relationships exist there. Yeah. If you do this, then you get there, which means that the system, the environment is stable, it's predictable, it's consistent, and there's a lot of certainty. And even if there is a bit of uncertainty here, we can actually use those probability statistics, figure out what the risk is, then we can calculate severity as well as frequency around here. And that makes us happy because there is some sense of control of what's going on here.
We've created that order, absolutely. And we know that approach is really great on objects.
Yeah, very much. It's a very mechanistic machine perspective here. And I kind of relate that to what engineering is all about from my background. Yeah. So I do scratch my head and kind of go like, ooh, resilience engineering. It does carry the flavor of engineering, where if we go into the complex system, it's different. And engineering doesn't quite work there because it's more ecological. It's more holistic. It's more working with mayonnaise. It's also what we call dispositional. So what does that mean? Dispositional means, as far as humans, there is a tendency for people to go that way, but there's no guarantee they're going to go that way. Right? Why? Because of the emotional factors. We don't know. There's some other reasons here, but we thought they'd go X, but they did a sharp right and went Y. What's going on here, right? And it's not right or wrong. It's like we just need to understand that's what human behavior is about here. And a lot of it is because of relationships, interactions here. And that, of course, brings this whole world about psychological safety here. I'd love to speak up, but I fear retribution or looking like a fool, because if I was a rational sort of objective person, I would share my story. But I'm irrational, I'm emotional. I don't want to share that story, so I'll stay silent on it.
Or it could even be what we call a cultural norm. So it may be that in your culture, it's not appropriate to do those things. And I think we have to stop asking ourselves why, and start to provide that environment where a person can see, I suppose, that them giving their view is actually healthy.
Yeah.
And that their view is considered. So like all these things, what I constantly see is that organisations that go down the sort of these different journeys around things like HOP and learning teams, I always say to them, what are you going to do with the information?
Mm-hmm.
You're going to go from getting a little to a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And the moment you don't do something with it, the moment that people aren't part of the solution, the moment you don't provide that feedback, you're going to undo all the good that you've tried to do.
Yeah, yeah.
You
And
can't start and stop.
yeah. And even if you're a consultant and you're really good at doing traditional surveys and doing questionnaires and interviews, and you go around and you collect a whole pile of stories here, maybe you're dealing with 100, maybe 150 stories, as an example here. We have actually projects where we collect 40,000 stories.
Yeah.
How did you, there's no way you can sit down and try to read 40,000 stories. This is why the importance of looking next level up at the patterns that kind of form.
Patterns of occurrence, clusters, all those great things. Absolutely.
Yeah. And then the SenseMaker software gives you the abilities that if people look at a cluster of stories and they go, oh, what's behind this? We can actually click on one of the dots, which is a story,
right,
and the story pops out so you can get a sense.
Which is
this is what's going on here.
Which is amazing. And certainly I'll be looking at the technology, Gary, because that sounds great, because it reminds me of a project back in my dark days of IT where our focus was purely on patterns of occurrence. So understanding where those patterns existed, and if you understand the pattern, you've got the ability to be able to more influence the future, not predict, but be able to influence. Look, it's no different. We did a project using learning teams where this organisation had people in the field doing emergency repairs. So the traditional means of safety was to basically, do a hazard ID. Well, I got to tell you, every situation they went into, the situation was unsafe because that's why it broke down. And all they're doing is simply having to write down the same hazards they're always having to encounter. So we said, well, what's the learning from repeating the same thing? Because the person has to be exposed to those hazards. They have to exist. There has to be electrical, there has to be hydraulic, there has to be mechanical. That's just normal.
Exactly.
And what we did was we turned it round to basically say, when did that person feel that the system was in a state that was safe enough for them to start their work?
Yeah.
That was putting it back to them. Okay? Because they're working alone. But then more importantly, we wanted them to reflect at the end of that job. And we wanted that reflection. So what we did, we created a little tool for them, just a little app on their phone, because it was integrated as part of their time logging and other things. At the end of the job, all they had to record is, they had to basically say, this is how I thought it would go. This is how I thought the job would go. This is how the job actually went in my mind. Where did I have to make do?
Yeah. Nice.
Where did I have to make do?
Yeah.
And those keywords then got captured. Now, we took a very simplistic approach, was that we then generated a word cloud.
Yeah, we do that as well. Yeah.
Very simple mechanism. The organization was collecting about 6,000 metrics a month. They're saying, what do we do? What do we do? And all we did was we got a group of workers to get together every 6 weeks, run a learning team as a group of worker looking at that word cloud.
Yeah, cool.
Now, that's just a very simplistic overview, whereas what you're saying is that you're providing that overview, but then you've got that context, that narrative that sits below it.
Yeah.
But what we found was that workers could identify 4 or 5 main clusters. Make sense?
Yep.
Everything clustered up. And then as a group of workers, they ran a learning team to then get context to understand that. You're taking that whole next level, which is fantastic, loving it.
Yeah. So what we're doing also is understanding that, the big push towards leading indicators as opposed to lagging indicators here, and I'm all for leading. We also know too that attitudes are leading indicators.
Yeah.
I've got a bad feeling about this either. I know something is not good going to happen. Those are attitudes, right? They haven't happened yet. So, but there's an attitude. There could be a propensity to do that here. We're trying to see if we can capture some of those things where it's kind of like, I don't feel good about Henry. He's gone quiet all of a sudden here. Is that a weak signal saying that Henry may be having some tendencies towards doing some damage to himself? We don't know, but maybe we have to monitor that. The cool thing with technology, and we can use it, Brent, is we can actually gather stories on a 24/7 basis, anytime, anywhere you want that. What we can also do too is that we can create for management a dashboard, and it's a real-time dashboard.
Sure.
And I have a demo. It's called Safety Pulse, and happy to give out the links and let people kick at the tires.
Sure.
Or if you actually enter a story, you can actually then go into the dashboard and you can see where your story lands, but also where maybe it fits in one of these heat maps as well.
Right.
So this allows the manager to kind of go like, oh my God, I can look forward as opposed to looking backwards through the mirror. Right?
Well, there's a reason why the rearview mirror is much smaller than the windscreen.
No kidding.
There is a reason. If you think about it, there's a reason why the rearview mirror is tiny.
Yeah.
The windscreen is large.
Yeah.
You can't tell by looking in the rearview mirror. Thank you, listeners, for being part of this podcast. We'd love to hear your learnings from today or other topics you would like us to support you on. Go to www.podcastlearnings.com and be part of the community of practice of learning teams at www.learningteamscommunity.com.
The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the host and its guest and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the company. Examples of analysis discussed within this podcast are only examples. They should not be utilized in the real world as the only solution available, as they are based only on very limited and dated open source information. Assumptions made within this analysis are not reflective of the position of the company. No part of this podcast may be reproduced, stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted in any form or by any means, mechanical, electronic, recording, or otherwise, without prior written permission of the creator of the podcast, Jay Allen.